Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. We're going to eat our way through Homer's Odyssey, or at least the parts that won't get us cursed by an angry sea god. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before you can chase glory across the wine-dark sea, outwit monsters, blind a cyclops, or spend 10 years trying to explain to your wife why you missed literally every family gathering, you first need breakfast. It may not sound heroic, but every great adventure begins with an ordinary meal. If you were living in the world of the Odyssey, your morning would be surprisingly familiar in some ways and deeply disappointing in others. You wouldn't wake to pancakes, scrambled eggs, buttery croissants, or a fresh cup of coffee. Coffee wouldn't arrive in Greece for another 2,000 years or so, which goes a long way toward explaining why so many arguments in Greek mythology escalated into curses lasting several generations. Instead, you wake with the sunrise. There are no alarm clocks. Your options are a rooster, a barking dog, or someone in your household loudly reminding you that daylight is being wasted. Snoozing isn't really a cultural tradition when the sheep need feeding. The air is cool, the smell of wood smoke drifts through the settlement, and someone is already tending the household fire. Whether you're a shepherd, fisherman, farmer, sailor, or servant, breakfast isn't designed to impress anyone. Ancient Greeks didn't believe in starting the day with a balanced brunch. They believed in eating enough that you wouldn't collapse halfway through ploughing a field. Your meal almost certainly begins with bread, not the fluffy white loaf waiting in plastic packaging at the supermarket. This bread is dense, coarse, and made mostly from barley. Barley was the dependable grain of ancient Greece. Wheat certainly existed, but it was harder to grow consistently and often reserved for wealthier households. Barley, on the other hand, tolerated poorer soils and stubborn weather, making it the dependable workhorse of Greek agriculture. The loaf itself is filling rather than exciting. It can be chewy, heavy, and occasionally so firm that you begin wondering whether it was originally intended as emergency construction material. To make it more enjoyable, you might dip it into olive oil, soften it with water, or eat it alongside a handful of olives. If fortune smiles upon you, someone cuts a piece of fresh goat's cheese. Congratulations. You've just assembled what Homer would probably describe as a satisfying meal, and what a modern food influencer would call a rustic Mediterranean breakfast experience, before charging $30 for it. Fresh fruit appears whenever the season allows. Figs are especially prized. Sweet, nutritious, and easy to dry for storage, they become one of the most common fruits throughout the Greek world. Grapes may be eaten fresh during harvest, or dried into raisins, while almonds and walnuts provide valuable calories for people expecting long hours of physical labour. Notice what's missing. There is almost no meat. That surprises many people because films often portray ancient heroes constantly tearing into enormous roasted legs of lamb. In reality, livestock represented wealth. Goats produced milk, sheep produced wool, oxen pulled ploughs. Killing one simply because you fancied bacon with breakfast would have been about as sensible as selling your car because you wanted a sandwich. Most families saved meat for religious festivals, sacrifices, weddings, or other important occasions. When an animal was sacrificed to the gods, the ceremony often became a community feast. Until then, your goat was considerably more useful alive than seasoned. And honestly, that makes the grand banquets in the Odyssey even more impressive. When Homer describes tables piled high with roasted meat, overflowing wine, fresh bread, and rich cheeses, he isn't describing an average Tuesday. He's signalling status, generosity, and hospitality. These are meals meant to announce that the host is wealthy enough to feed strangers without immediately regretting it. As you begin your own journey through the Odyssey, remember that beneath the monsters and miracles lies a very real world. A world where most mornings begin quietly, with barley bread, olives, cheese, a few figs, and perhaps the comforting thought that, with any luck, Poseidon probably won't ruin your day before lunch. Unfortunately for Odysseus, luck was never much of a breakfast companion. As you finish your modest breakfast, one thing becomes increasingly obvious. The real hero of the Odyssey isn't Odysseus. It's bread. That may sound unfair to the man who outsmarted a Cyclops, survived the wrath of Poseidon, resisted sirens, escaped monsters, and somehow still had enough patience left to deal with the suitors back home. But if you removed bread from the ancient Greek world, the entire society would begin falling apart much faster than Odysseus's travel itinerary. Nearly every meal revolved around it. Whenever Homer describes a feast, servants first bring baskets filled with bread before carving the meat or pouring the wine. It appears so frequently that readers often skip over it, much like you probably skip over the sentence, "They sat down to eat." Yet for Homer, bread wasn't background decoration. It was the foundation of every respectable meal. If you were living in Ithaca, you wouldn't simply buy a loaf on your way home. First, someone had to grow the grain. After harvest, the barley or wheat had to be dried, cleaned, and stored safely away from moisture, rodents, insects, and neighbours with suspiciously empty granaries. Then came grinding. This was the part everyone disliked. You kneel beside a stone quern, pushing another heavy stone back and forth for what feels like an eternity. Hour after hour, grain slowly becomes coarse flour. It's repetitive. It's exhausting. It's also an excellent reminder that your modern kitchen appliance deserves far more appreciation than it usually receives. By the time you've spent 2 hours grinding enough flour for the household, you'll look at an electric flour mill the same way Odysseus looked at a favourable wind. Once the flour is ready, it is mixed with water and sometimes a little salt before being shaped into simple loaves or flat cakes. Most homes baked using clay ovens or directly on heated stones near the household hearth. The smell of fresh bread drifting through the house would have been one of the most familiar comforts in Greek life. The texture, however, could vary dramatically. A wealthy household might enjoy lighter wheat bread, softer and more refined. Ordinary families relied mostly on barley, which produced darker, denser loaves that demanded a bit more chewing. You didn't casually nibble barley bread. You negotiated with it. Sometimes herbs were mixed into the dough. Occasionally olive oil was added for flavour. During prosperous years, honey might sweeten special breads prepared for festivals or religious ceremonies. But on ordinary days, simplicity ruled the table. Bread also carried symbolic importance. Offering bread to a guest wasn't merely about preventing hunger. It was a declaration of hospitality. Throughout the Odyssey, strangers are almost always fed before being questioned. Imagine arriving at someone's palace after weeks at sea, expecting an interrogation, only to be handed fresh bread, wine and roasted meat, before anyone even asked your name. Modern customer service departments could learn a thing or two. As you continue following Odysseus across the Mediterranean, you'll notice that kingdoms rise and fall, storms come and go, monsters appear without warning, and gods interfere whenever they're feeling particularly dramatic. But through every chapter of the journey, one humble loaf of bread remains faithfully on the table, quietly holding ancient Greek civilization together one meal at a time. By now you've discovered that bread is everywhere. Naturally, after several mouthfuls of dense barley loaf, you're probably ready for something to wash it down. Good news. The ancient Greeks had plenty of wine. Bad news. If you drink it the way you probably imagine, everyone at the table will immediately assume you've completely lost your mind. Throughout the Odyssey, wine appears almost as often as bread. Kings serve it to honoured guests. Sailors carry it aboard their ships. Shepherds offer it to travellers. Even Odysseus uses an exceptionally strong wine to intoxicate the Cyclops before revealing that introducing yourself as nobody can occasionally be a brilliant career move. Wine wasn't simply a luxury, it was part of everyday life. But there was one rule nearly every civilized Greek agreed upon. You mixed it with water. Drinking wine straight from the jar was considered something barbarians did, or people making spectacularly poor decisions. The Greeks believed undiluted wine clouded the mind, encouraged reckless behaviour, and generally made you act like someone who would challenge a sea god to an argument. History suggests they weren't entirely wrong. At a proper meal, a servant would bring out a large mixing bowl, known as a crater. This wasn't the vessel you drank from. Instead, it served as the communal mixing bowl where wine and water were combined, before being ladled into individual cups. The ratio varied. Sometimes 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Sometimes 2 to 1. Occasionally stronger, occasionally weaker. The point wasn't to avoid alcohol altogether. The point was to enjoy conversation without ending the evening by attempting to wrestle a statue of Athena. If you happened to be a guest in the palace of King Nestor or Menelaus, your cup would rarely remain empty for long. Hospitality required generosity, and generous hosts ensured everyone had enough to drink. Refusing to refill a guest's cup reflected poorly on the household. Of course, endless refills didn't necessarily mean endless drunkenness. Remember, this wine had already been diluted. The Greeks valued moderation almost as much as they valued good storytelling. A pleasant evening involved conversation, songs, poetry, and shared memories, not someone falling face first into the roast lamb while insisting they personally could have defeated the Trojan horse. Wine itself tasted different from what you might expect today. Ancient wines were often thicker, stronger, and less refined than modern varieties. Some were sweet, others surprisingly tart. Many were flavoured with herbs, spices, or even pine resin to improve preservation and alter the taste. If you've ever tried traditional Retsina, you'll have a small idea of how unusual ancient wine could seem to modern palates. The famous wine Odysseus gives the Cyclops, however, was no ordinary table wine. It was exceptionally potent, given to him by Meron, a priest of Apollo, who treasured it so highly that he rarely shared it with anyone. Homer tells us it was so concentrated that even this remarkable wine was normally mixed with 20 parts water before being served. The Cyclops, unfortunately, skipped that step. He drank it neat. Within a short time, the giant collapsed into a drunken sleep, proving that even mythical monsters should probably read the serving instructions before drinking. As you continue your journey through the Odyssey, you'll notice that every shared cup carries more than wine. It represents friendship, hospitality, peace, and trust. Long before contracts or signatures, offering someone a drink was often the first step toward becoming allies, provided, of course, neither of you happened to be a Cyclops. After washing down your barley bread with a carefully diluted cup of wine, you might begin wondering when the main course finally arrives. More specifically, where's the meat? If Hollywood has taught you anything about ancient Greece, it's probably that every meal involved enormous roasted legs of lamb, overflowing platters of beef, and muscular heroes dramatically tearing meat apart with their bare hands while discussing destiny. Reality was considerably less carnivorous. If you were an ordinary person living in the world of the Odyssey, meat was not an everyday food. It was a celebration, Animals were simply too valuable to eat whenever you felt like it. Your sheep produced wool year after year. Your goats supplied milk and cheese. Oxen pulled ploughs through stubborn fields that would otherwise refuse to grow your crops. Even pigs represented a family's savings account with legs. Killing one wasn't like stopping by a butcher. It was more like selling part of your livelihood. That's why many of the meat-filled feasts in the Odyssey happen during religious sacrifices. To modern readers, sacrificing an animal to a god might sound mysterious or even frightening. But for ancient Greeks, it was also one of the biggest community meals imaginable. The ceremony followed a familiar rhythm. First came prayers, then offerings to the gods. Only certain portions, often bones wrapped in fat and other designated pieces, were burned upon the altar as the divine share. According to Greek mythology, Prometheus had famously tricked Zeus into accepting the less desirable portions, allowing humans to keep the best meat for themselves. One of humanity's earliest successful negotiations, although it admittedly created several thousand years of tension afterward. Once the sacrifice was complete, the remaining meat didn't go to waste. Quite the opposite. It was carefully butchered, roasted over open fires, and shared among everyone present. A successful sacrifice wasn't simply a religious duty, it was dinner. Homer describes these scenes repeatedly. As Odysseus and his companions visit different kingdoms, servants prepare the animals, skewers are placed over glowing coals, and the smell of roasting meat fills the air long before anyone begins eating. The process itself required patience. Large pieces were cooked slowly over hardwood fires, turned by hand until the outside developed a crisp, browned crust, while the inside remained juicy. There were no meat thermometers, no gas grills, and certainly nobody asking whether the lamb should be medium rare. You simply hoped the cook knew what he was doing. Fortunately, many did. Seasonings were surprisingly modest. Olive oil might be brushed over the meat, along with salt and fragrant herbs gathered from nearby hillsides, such as oregano or thyme. The quality of the animal mattered more than elaborate spices. After all, imported pepper from India wasn't exactly sitting on every kitchen shelf. The greatest compliment you could pay a host wasn't about fancy recipes. It was generosity. The more meat placed before guests, the greater the honour being shown. This is why the palaces of Nestor, Menelaus, and later the halls of Ithaca are filled with lavish banquets. Their wealth isn't measured in gold piled on tables, but in their ability to slaughter valuable livestock without hesitation for visiting strangers. Imagine welcoming an unexpected traveller today by grilling your most expensive steak, opening your finest bottle of wine, and insisting they stay the night before even asking their name. That was hospitality in Homer's world. Of course, not everyone respected that generosity. As you'll soon discover, the suitors occupying Odysseus's palace become infamous for devouring his livestock day after day, treating another man's wealth as if it were an all-you-can-eat buffet with no closing time. As satisfying as the meals may have been, it turned out that eating someone else's cattle for several years came with consequences. Very sharp, very well-aimed consequences. Considering that you've spent the last several chapters sailing around the Aegean Sea, hopping from island to island, and listening to Poseidon personally sabotage your travel plans, you might reasonably expect seafood to dominate every meal. After all, you're surrounded by water. Surely dinner consists of fish every single evening. Surprisingly, not quite. Fish certainly played an important role in ancient Greek life, but if you read the Odyssey carefully, you'll notice something interesting. Homer spends far more time describing roasted cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs than grilled fish. For a poem centered around a sailor, there are remarkably few memorable seafood dinners. That isn't because the Greeks disliked fish. Far from it. If you lived along the coast, fishing was simply another part of daily life. Small boats headed out before sunrise, their crews carrying woven nets, bone hooks, harpoons, and baskets. Some fishermen cast circular nets from the shore, while others ventured farther into open water, hoping for larger catches. It was demanding work. There was no sonar, no weather forecast, and certainly no helpful app informing you that the tuna are biting today. Mostly, you relied on experience, patience, and a healthy amount of optimism. The Mediterranean offered an impressive variety of fish. Sea bream, mullet, grouper, tuna, mackerel, sardines, and anchovies all found their way onto ancient tables. Shellfish, such as mussels, oysters, octopus, squid, and cuttlefish, were also collected whenever conditions allowed. Some catches were eaten fresh. Others were salted or dried to last much longer, making them valuable provisions for long voyages. This preservation mattered enormously. Odysseus and his crew couldn't exactly stop at a seaside restaurant every afternoon. Salted fish was portable, nutritious, and survived weeks aboard a ship without immediately becoming a biological experiment. Even so, Homer rarely celebrates fish the way he celebrates roasted meat. Part of the reason lies in symbolism. The great feasts throughout the Odyssey are demonstrations of wealth and hospitality. Serving a guest an entire roasted ox or fattened sheep announces prosperity. Fish, while appreciated, simply didn't carry the same prestige. Offering someone grilled sardines was generous. Offering them a freshly sacrificed bull was unforgettable. Ironically, the men aboard Odysseus's ship probably wished fish appeared more often. There are moments during their voyage when food becomes desperately scarce. Storms blow them off course, supplies disappear, and hunting opportunities vanish. At one point, Homer describes the starving sailors catching fish with hooks simply to stay alive while trapped on an island. Suddenly that humble fish becomes infinitely more valuable than any royal banquet. Hunger has a remarkable ability to improve even the simplest menu. The Greeks understood this well. A meal wasn't judged only by what appeared on the table, but by when it appeared. A piece of dried fish after days of starvation could feel more luxurious than roast lamb served to someone already full. As you continue sailing with Odysseus, you'll notice that the sea gives generously one day and takes mercilessly the next. It provides fish, trade, and travel, but also storms, shipwrecks, and monsters with unsettling dietary preferences. It's a useful reminder that in the world of the Odyssey, even when dinner comes from the sea, it's usually best if the sea doesn't decide to eat you first. After days of bread, a little wine, and the occasional feast, you may be craving something creamy. Good news. The ancient Greeks loved dairy. Better news. The single greatest cheesemaker in the entire Odyssey also happens to be a one-eyed giant with an unfortunate habit of eating his guests. As culinary experiences go, it is decidedly mixed. When Odysseus and his men stumble into the cave of Polyphemus the Cyclops, they aren't just entering a monster's home. They're walking into what is essentially one of the finest dairy farms Homer ever describes. Before the giant even appears, the cave tells you everything. Large baskets overflow with cheese. Wooden racks are covered with aging wheels. Pails brim with fresh milk. Pens are filled with sheep and goats separated by age, while newborn lambs and kids are carefully kept apart from the adults. This isn't chaos. It's a well-run farm. If Polyphemus had been slightly less interested in eating sailors, he might have become ancient Greece's most successful artisan cheesemaker. Instead, he chose a rather different business model. The daily routine Homer describes would have been familiar across much of the Greek world. At dawn, shepherds led their flocks into hillsides covered with wild herbs. The animals grazed on thyme, oregano, sage, and countless other Mediterranean plants, naturally flavouring the milk they produced. By evening the flocks returned. Milking began immediately. Fresh milk, however, had one major problem. It spoiled quickly. Without refrigeration, you couldn't simply leave a clay jug sitting around until tomorrow morning. The solution was simple and remarkably effective. Turn it into cheese. Fresh milk was strained, curdled using natural enzymes taken from the stomachs of young animals, and then separated into curds and whey. The curds were pressed into moulds, salted and left to mature. Some cheeses were eaten fresh within days, while others aged for months, becoming firmer and easier to transport. In many ways, cheese functioned as the ancient world's refrigerator. It preserved valuable nutrients while lasting far longer than milk itself. For travellers like Odysseus, this made it almost perfect. A piece of hard goat or sheep cheese could survive long voyages, providing protein and fat when fresh food became scarce. It paired beautifully with bread, olives, and diluted wine, creating a meal that required no cooking and very little preparation. Not exactly glamorous. But when you've been rowing for 6 straight hours under the Mediterranean sun, convenience suddenly becomes a gourmet experience. Butter, interestingly, appears much less often. The Greeks generally preferred olive oil for cooking and flavouring. While butter was known, many Greeks associated it with northern peoples rather than their own cuisine. Olive oil was considered cleaner, more refined, and frankly far more delicious. As for yogurt, forms of fermented milk likely existed, although Homer says little about them. Cheese remained the undisputed champion of preserved dairy. Looking back, it's almost amusing that one of the Odyssey's most terrifying villains also provides one of its clearest windows into everyday food production. Behind the terrifying size, the single eye, and the alarming tendency to treat visitors as appetizers, Polyphemus was an exceptionally capable shepherd. Unfortunately, his hospitality skills never matured quite as well as his cheese. After enjoying bread, cheese, and a cup of watered wine, you might find yourself wanting something sweet. Don't expect chocolate, don't expect cake, and definitely don't expect a convenience store selling gummy bears every few kilometres. Instead, you reach for a fig. It may seem like a humble little fruit, but in the world of the Odyssey, figs were one of nature's greatest gifts. They were sweet, filling, easy to grow, and even easier to dry for long-term storage. Long before sugar became common, figs were one of the closest things the ancient Greeks had to dessert. And unlike dessert today, nobody would judge you for eating 5 of them, mostly because they were too busy doing exactly the same thing. If you wandered through the countryside of Ithaca, you'd see orchards scattered across rocky hillsides. Fig trees flourished in the Mediterranean climate, surviving hot summers that would leave many other crops struggling. Their fruit could be eaten fresh during harvest or carefully dried beneath the sun, creating a snack that lasted for months. For sailors preparing for long voyages, dried figs were almost perfect. They were lightweight, naturally sweet, packed with energy, and far less likely to spoil than fresh fruit. In other words, they were the ancient Greek equivalent of an energy bar, just with considerably fewer ingredients you couldn't pronounce. Grapes were equally important. Fresh grapes appeared during the harvest season, while raisins became another reliable source of sweetness throughout the year. Children enjoyed them, travellers carried them, and households stored them alongside grain for the colder months. After days of surviving on bread, cheese, olives, and whatever snacks fit inside a leather pouch, you finally receive an invitation that every traveller dreams of. A king wants you for dinner. Now, in the world of the Odyssey, This is either wonderful news or the beginning of a very complicated problem. Fortunately, your first royal stops are among the friendliest. When Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, leaves Ithaca to search for news of his missing father, he visits two of the greatest rulers in Greece, wise King Nestor at Pylos and King Menelaus in Sparta. Before either man asks why you've come, something far more important happens. You eat. To modern readers, that may seem backwards. Today you're usually expected to explain who you are before someone offers you dinner. Ancient Greek hospitality worked differently. First came food. Questions could wait. This tradition was known as xenia, the sacred law of hospitality protected by Zeus himself. Every stranger might be a traveller in need, or if the gods were feeling mischievous, a deity in disguise. Taking care of guests wasn't simply good manners. It was a religious obligation. Ignoring a hungry traveller wasn't just rude. It was potentially insulting to Zeus, and that was generally considered an excellent way to shorten your life expectancy. As you enter Nestor's palace, servants immediately begin preparing a feast. Fresh bread is placed on the tables. Wine is carefully mixed with water. Meat from recently sacrificed animals is roasted over glowing fires, filling the air with an aroma that probably convinced half the neighbourhood to suddenly become unexpected guests. No one is counting portions. No one asks whether you've earned the meal. You are simply welcomed. The same generosity appears when you later arrive in Sparta. Menelaus, one of the wealthiest kings in Greece, entertains guests with magnificent banquets worthy of someone who had once commanded armies outside the walls of Troy. Gold and silver decorate the palace, but the real display of wealth sits on the dining table. Tender roasted meat, fresh bread, cheese, olives, fruit, plenty of diluted wine, and enough food that nobody leaves hungry. For a king, generosity was one of the clearest demonstrations of power. Anyone could own livestock. Only a truly prosperous ruler could afford to slaughter valuable animals repeatedly for guests, travellers, and entire households without worrying about tomorrow. Of course, these feasts weren't rushed. People reclined, talked, listened to musicians, exchanged stories, and reflected on the Trojan War. Meals could last for hours. Food wasn't simply fuel. It was entertainment. It was diplomacy. It was memory. And occasionally, it was an opportunity for someone to tell an extremely long story that absolutely could have been summarized in 5 minutes. Fortunately, ancient Greeks were far more patient than modern dinner guests, checking their phones every 30 seconds. As you leave these royal halls, one lesson becomes unmistakably clear. In the Odyssey, the greatness of a king isn't measured only by the battles he has won or the treasures he owns. It's measured by how well he feeds complete strangers. Because in Homer's world, a table overflowing with food says far more about a person's character than a throne covered in gold ever could. After enjoying the generous hospitality of kings, you climb back aboard your ship, raise the sail, and point the bow toward home once again. Unfortunately, this is the Odyssey, so naturally, instead of making progress, you end up somewhere entirely unexpected. The wind carries your ship to the land of the Lotus Eaters, one of the most mysterious places in all of Greek mythology. There are no battles waiting for you, no terrifying monsters, no giants hurling boulders. At first glance, it seems almost peaceful. The locals greet strangers without hostility. They even offer you food. Normally, this would be excellent news. In this particular case, it's probably the worst meal you'll ever accept. Homer tells us that the inhabitants live on the fruit of the lotus plant. Exactly what this plant was remains one of history's greatest culinary mysteries. Scholars have debated it for centuries. Some believe it was a sweet fruit, perhaps related to the jujube tree that grows around the Mediterranean. Others have suggested a type of water lily, while a few have wondered whether Homer was describing something entirely mythical. Whatever it was, one thing is certain. It had an extraordinary effect. Anyone who ate the lotus immediately lost all desire to leave. The fruit didn't make people violent. It didn't poison them. It didn't put them to sleep. Instead, it gently erased ambition itself. Suddenly, home no longer mattered. Your family seemed distant. Your responsibilities quietly disappeared. The long voyage back to Ithaca felt unnecessary. You simply wanted to sit beneath the warm sun, eat more lotus, and let the days drift by forever. It sounds strangely pleasant. For about 5 minutes. Then you remember you've abandoned your wife, your kingdom, your aging father, and an entire crew depending on you. Modern readers often compare the lotus to narcotics or other mind-altering substances, but Homer never actually describes it that way. Instead, the fruit seems to symbolize something deeper: forgetfulness, comfort, the temptation to stop striving altogether. It's one of the first great tests Odysseus faces. Not every danger arrives with claws or swords. Sometimes the greatest threat is simply becoming comfortable enough to stop moving forward. When several of Odysseus's sailors eat the lotus, they refuse to return to the ships. They beg to remain with the lotus eaters forever, content to spend the rest of their lives doing absolutely nothing. Odysseus has no choice. He physically drags his own men back to the ships, ties them beneath the benches, and orders the crew to sail immediately before anyone else samples the local cuisine. It's probably the least enthusiastic restaurant review in ancient history. Excellent atmosphere, friendly staff. Food was so relaxing we had to kidnap our friends before dessert. The episode also reminds you how important memory is throughout the Odyssey. Odysseus survives because he never forgets who he is or where he belongs. Every meal you've encountered so far has strengthened travellers, honoured guests, or celebrated community. The lotus does the opposite. It feeds the body while quietly stealing the purpose that gives life direction. As you leave the island behind, you realise that not every delicious meal is worth accepting. Some foods satisfy your hunger, others make you forget why you were hungry in the first place. After escaping the land of the lotus eaters, you've learned one important lesson. Not every meal is what it seems. Unfortunately, the Odyssey believes repetition is the best teacher, so before long, you arrive on another mysterious island where an inviting dinner once again turns out to be a spectacularly bad decision. This time, the hostess is Circe. Unlike the Cyclops, Circe doesn't greet strangers with brute force. She doesn't roar, throw rocks, or slam giant cave doors behind you. Quite the opposite. She welcomes guests. She smiles. She prepares a beautiful meal. And if someone offers you warm bread, fine cheese, roasted meat, and a perfectly mixed cup of wine after weeks at sea, your first instinct is probably to say yes. Odysseus's crew certainly does. The house itself feels almost magical. Smoke rises gently from the hearth. Wild animals wander peacefully around the estate, not attacking anyone, but behaving strangely tame. Lions and wolves lounge outside as though they've suddenly decided retirement suits them better than hunting. It's charming. It's also an enormous warning sign. Generally speaking, if wolves are behaving like affectionate house cats, something unusual is happening. Inside, Circe lays out a magnificent feast. Homer describes bread, cheese, barley, wine, and rich food served generously to the weary sailors. Everything looks perfectly normal. Everything smells wonderful. There is only one small complication. The wine contains a powerful potion. As the exhausted sailors eat and drink without suspicion, Circe quietly taps them with her wand. Within moments, they're pigs. Not metaphorically, not because they've developed poor table manners. Actual pigs. It's one of the strangest dining experiences in all of Greek mythology, and perhaps the only dinner party where complaining about the food becomes physically impossible. Fortunately for everyone involved, Odysseus never joins the meal. Warned by the messenger god Hermes, he receives a mysterious herb called moly, said to protect him from Circe's magic. Homer describes its black roots and white flower, noting that only the gods can easily pull it from the earth. Armed with this divine protection, Odysseus drinks the enchanted wine himself. Nothing happens. Circe is stunned. For perhaps the first time in years, a dinner guest survives long enough to politely object to becoming livestock. Rather than fighting, the two eventually reach an understanding. Circe restores Odysseus's companions to human form, and something unexpected happens. Everyone stays. Not for a night. Not for a week. For an entire year. During that time, Circe's halls provide abundant food and drink. The crew enjoys roasted meats, fresh bread, cheese, olives, fruit, and endless cups of watered wine. After months of storms, starvation, and constant danger, they finally experience comfort. Too much comfort. Eventually, Odysseus's men have to remind their own captain that Ithaca still exists. It's an amusing reversal. Earlier, Odysseus dragged his sailors away from the Lotus Eaters because they had forgotten home. Now his own crew must persuade him to stop enjoying Circe's hospitality and continue the journey. Apparently, even legendary heroes can become surprisingly attached to a good cook. The episode reveals something subtle about food throughout the Odyssey. Meals are never just meals. They test character, reveal intentions, and sometimes determine the course of the entire story. A shared table can symbolize friendship, temptation, generosity, or danger. In Circe's case, it manages to be all four at once. The food is delicious, the company becomes pleasant, the hospitality eventually proves genuine, but it's still probably wise to ask what's in the wine before accepting a second cup. After spending a comfortable year at Circe's table, you might start thinking life has finally become manageable. There's fresh bread, roasted meat, wine, a roof over your head. For once, nobody is trying to eat you. Naturally, this means it's time to get back on the ship. The moment you leave civilization behind, your menu changes dramatically. Royal banquets disappear almost overnight. The sea doesn't care whether you once dined with kings. It offers no bakeries, no olive groves, and certainly no helpful taverns every few miles. When you're sailing with Odysseus, every meal depends on one question. Did you remember to pack enough food? Before setting sail, crews loaded their ships with whatever could survive long journeys. Fresh bread was eaten first, while harder barley biscuits lasted much longer. Wheels of goat or sheep cheese travelled well, as did dried figs, raisins, olives, nuts, and salted fish. Wine was stored in large clay amphorae, carefully secured so they wouldn't roll around every time Poseidon decided to express his feelings. Fresh water was even more valuable. Unlike food, you couldn't simply assume you'd find clean drinking water on every island. Springs were precious discoveries, and filling every container became an urgent priority before continuing the voyage. Running out of bread was inconvenient. Running out of water was terrifying. Despite careful planning, supplies rarely lasted as long as expected. Storms could keep ships at sea for days. Unfavourable winds delayed entire fleets. Islands that looked promising sometimes offered little more than rocky cliffs and disappointed sailors. Hunger became an unwelcome companion. Homer occasionally reminds us just how desperate things became. At one point, Odysseus's men survive by fishing with hooks whenever the opportunity arises. Every fish caught is another day bought from starvation. Imagine spending hours under the blazing Mediterranean sun, rowing until your shoulders ache, only to celebrate catching a single fish large enough to divide among dozens of hungry men. Suddenly, that luxurious feast in Sparta feels like another lifetime. Meals aboard ship were also remarkably simple. There were no elaborate kitchens below deck. Fires on wooden ships were dangerous. So much of the food required little preparation. Bread, cheese, dried fruit, olives, and preserved fish could all be eaten immediately. Whenever the crew landed safely ashore, they seized the opportunity to cook fresh meat, gather fruit, refill water, and repair their supplies. Every successful landing became both a campsite and a grocery store. Assuming, of course, the island wasn't inhabited by monsters, witches, giant cannibals, or gods having an unusually bad day. Unfortunately for Odysseus, those possibilities occurred with alarming frequency. The constant uncertainty transformed food into something far more important than comfort. Every loaf of bread represented planning. Every amphora of wine represented preparation. Every dried fig represented another mile toward home. It's easy to overlook these humble provisions while reading about cyclopes and sirens, but without them, the adventure would have ended very quickly. Heroes still need calories. Even the cleverest man in Greece can't outwit starvation forever. As your ship pushes farther across the wine-dark sea, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Odysseus doesn't survive for 10 years because he's the strongest warrior alive. He survives because he never stops searching for the next safe place to find food, water, and the strength to keep sailing one more day. After months of dining with kings, escaping monsters, and surviving on whatever your ship happened to be carrying, you finally arrive somewhere that feels ordinary. No palace, no golden goblets, no enchantresses. Just a humble hut standing among the hills of Ithaca. Oddly enough, it becomes one of the warmest meals in the entire Odyssey. The man welcoming you is Eumaeus, the loyal swineherd. He doesn't know that the tired stranger standing before him is actually Odysseus in disguise. As far as he's concerned, you're simply another traveller in need of shelter, and that's enough. Without asking for proof of your identity, he invites you inside. The hut is simple but comfortable. Smoke rises gently from the central hearth. Wooden beams support the roof. Clay jars line the walls, filled with precious supplies, carefully stored for the coming months. Outside, hundreds of pigs wander the hillsides under the watchful eyes of loyal dogs. This isn't the wealth of kings. It's the wealth of honest work. Before long, Eumaeus begins preparing dinner. He selects 2 young pigs from his herd, offers a brief prayer to the gods, and carefully slaughters them. Nothing is rushed. Every step follows familiar customs that have likely been repeated countless times before. The meat is cleaned, cut into portions, skewered, and roasted over glowing coals until the fat begins to sizzle and drip into the fire. The smell alone is enough to make your stomach forget every miserable day spent rowing across the Mediterranean. Beside the meat comes fresh bread. There are bowls of wine mixed properly with water, perhaps some olives, maybe a little cheese remaining from earlier in the day. Nothing extravagant appears on the table, yet somehow it feels more satisfying than many royal banquets. That's because Eumaeus offers something no amount of gold can buy: sincerity. Throughout the meal he speaks honestly about his missing master, Odysseus. He refuses to believe the wild rumours spread by wandering strangers, yet he never stops hoping that one day his king will return. Sitting across from him, Odysseus listens in silence, hearing another man praise his character while having absolutely no idea he's speaking to the very person himself. It's probably one of the few moments in history where complimenting your boss directly to his face happened completely by accident. The meal also reminds you that hospitality doesn't depend on wealth. Earlier, kings welcomed strangers because they possessed abundant resources. Eumaeus welcomes strangers despite having very little. In many ways, his generosity costs far more. Every piece of roasted pork he serves comes from animals he has spent years raising. Every loaf of bread represents hours of labour in the fields. Every cup of wine reflects careful harvests and patient storage. Nothing on this table is wasted. Nothing is taken for granted. As you leave Eumaeus's humble hut, it becomes clear that this simple dinner captures the true spirit of the Odyssey. The finest meal isn't always the one served on silver plates inside magnificent palaces. Sometimes it's shared beside a small fire by someone whose greatest wealth is kindness. And in Homer's world, that kind of hospitality is worth more than all the gold in Mycenae. After all the careful planning, the preserved cheese, the dried figs, the salted fish, and the endless search for fresh water, you finally think you've learned the secret to surviving the Odyssey. Don't anger the gods. Simple enough. Unfortunately, hunger has a remarkable talent for making simple rules feel surprisingly negotiable. As your ship reaches the island of Thrinacia, Odysseus gives his crew one instruction that could not be clearer. Do not touch the cattle, not one. Not even if you're starving. These magnificent herds belong to Helios, the sun god. They aren't ordinary livestock wandering across green meadows. They are sacred animals, watched over day and night by Helios's daughters, Lampetia and Phaethusa. Every single cow is accounted for. Every sheep is known. There is, quite literally, no such thing as stealing one without someone noticing. Odysseus knows this because both the prophet Tiresias and the enchantress Circe have warned him. Harm the cattle and disaster will follow. For a while, everyone behaves. The crew pulls their ships ashore and waits for favourable winds. They ration what little food remains. Bread grows scarce. The cheese disappears. The dried fruit is gone. Even the salted fish begins running out. Then the weather changes. A violent storm traps them on the island. One day becomes several. Several become weeks. Their supplies vanish completely. Hunger slowly transforms from an uncomfortable feeling into an obsession. If you've ever opened the refrigerator every 10 minutes hoping that somehow new food had magically appeared since the last time you looked, you'll understand the general direction their thinking was heading. Except their situation is considerably more serious. At first, they survive by catching fish and hunting birds whenever possible. Homer tells us they scrape together whatever food they can find. But it isn't enough. Eventually, while Odysseus leaves to pray alone, the crew reaches a desperate conclusion. Their leader isn't here. The gods might forgive them. Besides, as one sailor argues, isn't it better to die after eating well than starve slowly? History remembers these words for a reason. Their spectacularly bad reasoning. Led by Eurylochus, the men slaughter Helios's finest cattle. They prepare a magnificent feast, roasting the sacred meat over open fires. After weeks of hunger, it is probably the most satisfying meal they have eaten in months. The smell must have been incredible. The consequences were even more impressive. Homer describes terrifying omens almost immediately. The hides of the slaughtered cattle begin crawling across the ground. The meat placed upon the spit seems to bellow like living animals. It's the ancient Greek equivalent of your dinner looking back at you and expressing disappointment. When Odysseus returns, he immediately understands what has happened. The feast is over. The journey is over. They simply don't know it yet. Once the storm finally passes and the ship returns to sea, Helios demands justice from Zeus himself. The king of the gods listens. A thunderbolt crashes from the sky. The ship explodes into splinters. One by one, every member of Odysseus's crew disappears beneath the waves. Only Odysseus survives. As you continue the final stretch of the Odyssey, this tragic meal becomes impossible to forget. Throughout your journey, food has represented hospitality, survival, friendship, and celebration. Here, for the first time, it becomes something else entirely. Temptation. Sometimes the most expensive meal you'll ever eat isn't the one that costs the most money. It's the one you were warned never to touch in the first place. While you've been sailing through storms, surviving shipwrecks, resisting monsters, and carefully rationing every last piece of bread, something rather infuriating has been happening back in Ithaca. Your palace has turned into the world's most expensive free buffet. For nearly 20 years, more than 100 suitors have occupied Odysseus' home, each hoping to marry his wife Penelope, now that they assume the king is long dead. They don't simply visit for the afternoon. They move in, they eat, they drink, then they wake up the next morning and do it all again. If you've ever had a house guest stay one day longer than expected, imagine multiplying that feeling by about 7,000. Every morning begins the same way. Servants prepare bread. Wine is mixed in great bowls. Cooks slaughter sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle from Odysseus's own herds. Fires burn continuously as roasted meat fills the palace with its rich aroma. The tables are never empty, neither are the wine cups. The suitors feast as though the food appears by magic. Of course it doesn't. Every loaf of bread represents grain planted by Odysseus's farmers. Every animal comes from his flocks. Every jar of wine was produced from his vineyards. They're consuming years of careful labour while contributing absolutely nothing in return. It's a remarkably successful business model, unless you're the one paying for it. Homer repeatedly emphasises that the greatest crime of the suitors isn't simply wanting to marry Penelope. It's their abuse of hospitality. Earlier in your journey, you've seen kings gladly feed complete strangers because Xenia, the sacred law of hospitality, demands generosity. The guest respects the host, and the host protects the guest. The suitors reverse the entire relationship. They become permanent guests who behave like owners. They insult servants. They mock beggars. They waste food without gratitude. Worst of all, they never consider leaving. One of the clearest examples comes when Odysseus finally returns to Ithaca, disguised as an old beggar. Hungry after everything he has endured, he enters his own hall asking for a small piece of bread. Most of the suitors laugh. Some insult him. One, Antinous, becomes so enraged that he throws a heavy footstool across the room, striking the disguised king. Imagine eating another man's food for years, inside another man's house, before throwing furniture at him because he asked for a snack. Even Zeus probably paused for a moment and thought, "That's impressively rude." Meanwhile, the feast continues. The suitors laugh loudly, drink deeply, and order more meat from the kitchens. They believe tomorrow will look exactly like today. More roasted lamb, more fresh bread, more wine, more entertainment. Your alarm clock is approximately 150 million kilometres away, made almost entirely of burning hydrogen, and has absolutely no sympathy for your desire to sleep another 10 minutes. For most of human history, that glowing ball in the sky decided when your day began. No snooze button, no gentle melody, no phone vibrating under your pillow. Just sunlight creeping across your face, birds beginning their endless debates outside, and the uncomfortable realization that everyone else had probably started working already. If you lived thousands of years ago, waking up wasn't something you scheduled to the minute. It was something you adapted to. Before mechanical clocks became common, time itself was surprisingly flexible. Farmers, shepherds, fishermen, merchants, and craftsmen all lived according to rhythms that had far more to do with nature than with numbers on a dial. In the summer, this meant very early mornings. Dawn arrived long before what most people today would consider a reasonable hour. But those extra daylight hours were precious. Crops needed tending before the afternoon heat. Animals demanded feeding whether you felt awake or not. Bread had to be baked. Markets opened shortly after sunrise, and nobody was delaying commerce because someone stayed up gossiping around the fire. Winter was another story entirely. The sun appeared much later, the morning stayed bitterly cold, and climbing out from beneath layers of wool blankets became an act requiring genuine courage. Fortunately, winter also meant shorter working days in many places. There was simply less daylight available, and without electric lighting, extending the workday was expensive, inconvenient, or impossible. Ancient civilizations embraced this seasonal rhythm rather than fighting it. Egyptians organized work around the rising Nile and the dependable sunrise. Greeks often began public business in the cool morning hours before the Mediterranean heat became unbearable. Romans opened shops early, conducted legal affairs after sunrise, and viewed the early morning as the most productive part of the day. Sleeping until midday wasn't considered luxurious. It suggested laziness, illness, or that you had attended a banquet with entirely too much wine the night before. Even medieval villages followed nature's timetable. As the eastern sky slowly brightened, people gradually stirred awake. Roosters crowed with remarkable confidence, regardless of whether anyone appreciated the performance. Dogs barked, livestock shuffled impatiently, and neighbours began moving about. Entire communities became living alarm clocks, each household unknowingly helping wake the next. But sunlight alone wasn't always enough. Bakers, monks, guards, travellers, and countless others often needed to rise while the stars were still overhead. So if dawn hadn't arrived yet, what exactly pulled them out of bed? As dependable as the sunrise was, it had one obvious flaw. Sometimes you needed to wake up before it. If you were a baker, your bread needed to be ready when everyone else woke up. If you were a fisherman, calm waters before dawn were worth sacrificing sleep for. Monks gathered for prayers while most of the village was still dreaming, and soldiers standing the final watch certainly couldn't tell their commander they had accidentally overslept. Without clocks, this sounds like an impossible problem. Surprisingly, people became remarkably good at waking themselves. One of the oldest methods was simple mental preparation. Long before psychologists gave it fancy names, people discovered that the human brain could be surprisingly obedient. Before going to bed, they would repeatedly remind themselves they had to rise before first light. It sounds suspiciously like something your modern productivity guru would recommend, except theirs usually involves a podcast and a 12-step morning routine. Ancient writers occasionally mentioned this ability with admiration. Roman philosophers noted that disciplined individuals often woke naturally when duty called. It wasn't considered magical. It was considered evidence of self-control. Your body, after all, was expected to obey your mind, not the other way around. There were also more practical techniques. Many people intentionally drank plenty of water before sleeping. It wasn't exactly sophisticated engineering, but a full bladder has always been one of humanity's most reliable biological alarms. The downside, of course, was that your emergency wake-up call arrived with absolutely no option to ignore it. Others slept in slightly uncomfortable positions when they absolutely couldn't afford to oversleep. Instead of sinking into the warmest corner beside the fire, They might rest sitting upright or with fewer blankets. Comfort was wonderful, unless comfort convinced you to sleep until breakfast had already become lunch. Families often helped one another as well. Large households rarely slept independently. Parents woke older children. Older siblings shook younger ones awake. Servants roused their masters. Apprentices woke before their craftsmen. In many homes, one person's schedule quietly determined everyone else's. Over time, people also developed astonishingly accurate internal rhythms. Living without artificial lighting meant their bodies followed daylight much more closely than ours often do today. After weeks, months, or years of repeating the same routine, waking before dawn became less of a struggle and more of a habit. Still, habits occasionally failed. And when an entire town needed to wake together, relying on thousands of individual bladders and good intentions was hardly an efficient system. Communities needed something louder, something impossible to sleep through, and preferably something that could be heard from miles away. If there was one sound that could compete with the sunrise, it was a church bell. Long before alarm clocks sat on bedside tables, church towers became the closest thing Europe had to a public notification system. They didn't just announce religious services, they announced life itself. Work began with them. Markets opened after them. Meetings followed them. Even disasters had their own distinctive ringing patterns. If you heard the bells at an unusual hour, chances were someone somewhere was having a much worse morning than you. For ordinary villagers, the first bell often arrived before dawn. Monasteries had already been awake for hours. Monks followed strict schedules that divided both day and night into periods of prayer known as the canonical hours. Their earliest service, matins, frequently took place while the world outside remained completely dark. Imagine being peacefully asleep when suddenly a massive bronze bell reminds you that somewhere nearby a group of devoted monks has already started singing. It was difficult not to feel slightly less productive. The monks themselves relied on these bells just as much as everyone else. Someone had to wake first, light candles, prepare the chapel, and climb the tower to ring the bell that would wake the rest of the community. Being the monastery's designated bell ringer probably wasn't the most popular assignment during January. Outside monastery walls, villages gradually synchronized their lives around these familiar sounds. Farmers heard the bell and headed toward the fields. Craftsmen unlocked their workshops. Children reluctantly prepared for another day of chores. Even people who couldn't actually see the church could often hear its bells rolling across valleys and fields. In larger medieval towns, the bells served an even greater purpose. Not everyone owned a clock, and even if they did, early mechanical clocks weren't especially reliable. But everyone could hear a bell. It was free, impossible to ignore, and remarkably effective. In many ways, it transformed hundreds or even thousands of individuals into a single coordinated community. One sound, one shared beginning. Different bells also carried different meanings. A slow, steady ringing might call people to worship. A rapid, frantic peal could signal fire, invasion, or another emergency. Experienced townsfolk learned to recognize the difference instantly, much as modern people can distinguish a phone notification from a smoke alarm. Of course, not everyone lived close enough to hear church bells. Shepherds slept on distant hillsides. Travellers camped along lonely roads. Fishermen often spent the night near rivers or harbours, far beyond the reach of any bell tower. For them, waking up required something far more personal, and often far more inventive. Of course, church bells could only do so much. If you lived too far from the nearest village, or if your job kept you awake while everyone else slept, you needed another way to start the day. Fortunately, humans have always excelled at turning other living creatures, and occasionally each other, into alarm clocks. Let's begin with the rooster. Popular culture has convinced us that every rooster crows precisely at sunrise, as though each one carries a tiny Swiss watch hidden beneath its feathers. Reality is a little less impressive. Roosters actually crow throughout the day and often begin long before the sun appears. They respond to changing light, but they also possess an internal biological clock that tells them morning is approaching. This made them surprisingly useful companions. A farmhouse filled with chickens rarely stayed quiet for long. One rooster would begin announcing his existence, another would answer from a neighbouring farm, and before long the countryside sounded like an endless argument between birds who all believed they had personally invented the dawn. You may not have enjoyed the performance, but you were probably awake. Dogs contributed in their own way. Livestock certainly did. Cows expected milking at roughly the same time every day, and expressed their opinions rather loudly if breakfast was delayed. Horses stamped impatiently inside stables. Sheep bleated. Pigs complained with remarkable enthusiasm. Living on a farm meant your entire livelihood became one giant noisy reminder that sleeping in was not part of the business model. Inside wealthier households, people often relied on servants. Large, noble residences followed carefully organised routines. Senior servants woke before everyone else to light fireplaces, fetch water, prepare clothing, and begin breakfast. Once the household was ready, they moved from room to room, knocking on doors, opening shutters, and politely encouraging sleepy aristocrats to remember they had responsibilities beyond remaining comfortably wrapped in expensive blankets. Kings were no exception. Royal households operated like enormous machines, with dozens or even hundreds of attendants keeping every hour of the day on schedule. A late-rising monarch could delay audiences, meals, ceremonies, and an entire court's routine. Even the most powerful ruler in Europe usually had someone whose morning job involved saying, in the politest possible terms, "Your Majesty, it's time." In smaller villages, neighbours unintentionally became part of everyone's wake-up routine. Thin walls carried conversations. Wooden floors creaked loudly. Someone chopping firewood before dawn created a rhythm the entire street could hear. Doors slammed, carts rattled over uneven roads, and the smell of fresh bread drifted through the air before many people had even opened their eyes. The village itself became an alarm clock, one made not of gears and springs, but of hundreds of ordinary people beginning another ordinary day together. One of the biggest surprises about mornings before alarm clocks is that many people didn't actually sleep straight through the night. For centuries, especially in medieval and early modern Europe, it was perfectly normal to have what historians call segmented sleep. Instead of one uninterrupted 8-hour stretch, many people experienced a first sleep followed by a second sleep, with an hour or two of quiet wakefulness in between. Imagine going to bed shortly after sunset. Without electric lights, evenings were short. Candles were expensive, oil lamps weren't exactly cheap either, and staring into complete darkness quickly lost its entertainment value. So people often climbed into bed just a few hours after dusk, falling into a deep first sleep that lasted roughly 3 or 4 hours. Then something interesting happened. They woke up. Not because anything was wrong, not because they had insomnia, simply because that was how their bodies often worked. For an hour or so, houses quietly came back to life. Some people prayed. Others added wood to the fire. Farmers checked on animals. Mothers fed infants. Couples talked about the coming day or, judging by more than a few historical references, occasionally found other ways to pass the time. Physicians of the period even considered this middle-of-the-night interval a particularly healthy moment for conversation, reflection, and, rather optimistically, romance. Once this peaceful break ended, Everyone simply returned to bed for their second sleep, remaining there until dawn finally arrived. It sounds unusual today, but in communities without electric lighting, this rhythm may have felt completely natural. Modern sleep researchers have even found that when people spend weeks without artificial light, many gradually return to a similar pattern. Your ancestors may not have been sleeping badly at all. They were simply sleeping differently. This routine also made early mornings a little easier. By the time the rooster crowed or the church bells echoed across the village, many people had already been awake once during the night. They weren't being ripped from the deepest stage of sleep by a phone blaring electronic beeps. Instead, their bodies had often completed too shorter periods of rest, making the transition into morning feel surprisingly gradual. Of course, not everyone enjoyed this luxury. Some professions ignored natural sleep entirely. Bakers began work while most people were still in their second sleep. Fishermen launched boats beneath the stars. Night watchmen finished their shifts just as everyone else was opening their eyes. For them, waking up wasn't the hardest part of the day. The real challenge was staying awake while the rest of the world was only just beginning. While most of the village was still enjoying the final moments of sleep, a surprising number of people had already been awake for hours. If you wanted fresh bread with your breakfast, someone had to bake it while the stars were still shining. That someone was usually the baker. The workday of a medieval or ancient baker often began shortly after midnight. Flour had to be mixed, dough kneaded by hand, ovens heated with enormous amounts of wood, and loaves prepared before the first customers appeared. Since wood-fired ovens could take several hours to reach the right temperature, sleeping until sunrise simply wasn't an option. Imagine waking at 1 a.m. every single day, 6 days a week, just so complete strangers could complain that your bread wasn't warm enough. Humanity, it seems, has always found reasons to criticize breakfast. Fishermen lived by a similarly unforgiving schedule. The calmest waters usually arrived before sunrise. Lakes and seas were often quieter, winds gentler, and fish more active during the cool early hours. By the time the town was beginning to stir, many fishing boats had already been working for hours, returning with the day's catch before the afternoon heat spoiled it. Farmers also greeted the morning earlier than most. During harvest season, every minute of daylight mattered. In hot climates, heavy labour became almost unbearable once the sun climbed higher into the sky. Beginning work before dawn allowed workers to complete several productive hours before the heat transformed the fields into open-air ovens. Even today, farmers across many parts of the world still follow this ancient rhythm. Then there were the monks. Life inside a monastery revolved around prayer rather than convenience. The first service of the day often began deep in the night, long before ordinary villagers even considered opening their eyes. Bells echoed through dark stone corridors as sleepy monks left their beds, lit candles, and gathered to chant together. It wasn't designed to be comfortable. Rising before dawn was viewed as an act of discipline, humility, and devotion. Night watchmen experienced perhaps the strangest mornings of all. Their work ended just as everyone else's began. They spent the darkness patrolling city walls, guarding gates, watching for fires, chasing away thieves, and occasionally trying to stay awake while absolutely nothing happened for hours. As merchants opened shops and children spilled into the streets, the watchman finally headed home to sleep. So while one half of society was just beginning its day, the other had already lived an entire morning. It was a reminder that before alarm clocks, mornings didn't begin at the same moment for everyone. They began whenever your responsibilities demanded them. Before you take your first step into an ancient city, it might be wise to stop breathing. Not forever, of course. That would make the rest of this story rather difficult. But if you could politely hold your breath for the next few streets, your nose would probably thank you. Modern cities certainly have their unpleasant moments. A forgotten garbage truck in July, a suspicious subway station, that one public restroom everyone silently agrees to avoid. But compared to most towns and cities before the 19th century, today's streets smell almost unimaginably clean. For most of history, bad smells weren't occasional accidents. They were simply part of life. Imagine entering a busy Roman street just after sunrise. Merchants are opening their shops. Bakers have already filled the air with the comforting smell of fresh bread. For a brief moment, you think perhaps history wasn't so unpleasant after all. Then reality arrives. A donkey slowly wanders past, leaving behind a steaming reminder that animals had absolutely no interest in public hygiene. A cart pulled by 2 horses adds its own contribution a few meters later. Nearby, fish left out since yesterday are beginning to lose their battle with the Mediterranean sun. Across the street, someone empties a chamber pot into the gutter with remarkable confidence that nobody important is standing below. Welcome to another perfectly ordinary morning. The smell wasn't one single odour. It was hundreds of them competing for your attention at the same time. Fresh manure mixed with old manure. Rotting vegetables from yesterday's market. Smoke drifting from fireplaces burning damp wood. Leather workshops soaking animal hides in foul-smelling chemicals. Public toilets that had seen far better centuries. Open drains carrying whatever the previous household decided they no longer wanted inside. Your nose would have no idea where to begin. Oddly enough, the people who actually lived there rarely complained as much as we might expect, partly because they had little choice. If every street smelled similar, there wasn't much point in discussing it over dinner. More importantly, they had grown up surrounded by these odours. Just as modern city dwellers eventually stopped noticing constant traffic noise, many historical people became accustomed to smells that would make modern visitors retreat after 5 minutes. That doesn't mean they enjoyed them. In fact, many ancient and medieval writers openly described cities as foul, unhealthy, and overwhelming. They simply lacked the tools to eliminate the problem. Waste accumulated faster than anyone could remove it, and every day thousands of people and thousands of animals added a little more to the growing pile. Which raises an obvious question. If cities produced mountains of waste every single day, where exactly did all of it go? The unfortunate answer is, usually not very far. Every city has to solve one unavoidable problem. People eat, animals eat, markets sell food, workshops produce scraps, and sooner or later, every single one of those things becomes waste. Today, you wheel a bin to the curb, and magically, while you're asleep, it disappears. For most of history, there was considerably less magic involved. If you lived in an ancient or medieval town, the easiest solution was simply to throw unwanted things outside. Not always directly into the street, thankfully. Many homes had small courtyards, backyard pits, or simple ditches. But once those filled up, the nearest gutter became surprisingly attractive. Kitchen scraps, spoiled vegetables, broken pottery, ashes from fireplaces, animal bones after dinner, and countless other leftovers often ended up outdoors. Some of it would eventually decompose. Some would be eaten by animals. Some would simply remain where it landed until someone finally decided it had become somebody else's problem. Human waste created an even bigger challenge. In Roman cities, wealthier neighbourhoods often had access to impressive sewer systems connected to public latrines. The Romans deserved genuine credit here. Their engineering was centuries ahead of much of Europe. Running water constantly flushed many public toilets, carrying waste into enormous underground sewers, like the famous Cloaca Maxima beneath Rome. Unfortunately, there was one small complication. Most people didn't actually have toilets connected directly to these sewers. Many families relied on chamber pots instead. During the night, these portable containers performed their rather unpleasant duty indoors. The following morning, someone had to empty them. Ideally, the contents went into designated cesspits or public latrines. Ideally. Reality was often considerably less disciplined. In crowded neighbourhoods, waste sometimes found its way into open drains, vacant lots, nearby rivers, or simply onto the street itself. Some cities even passed laws requiring residents to announce themselves before emptying chamber pots from upper-storey windows. Imagine hearing someone yell the medieval equivalent of "incoming" and realising you had about 2 seconds to reconsider your walking route. Not everyone remembered to shout. Rain occasionally helped by washing some of this waste away, but rain also transformed narrow streets into muddy mixtures of water, manure, food scraps, and things most people preferred not to identify too closely. Walking across town after a heavy storm became less of a pleasant stroll and more of an obstacle course. And humans weren't even the biggest contributors, because wherever people lived, animals lived alongside them, and they produced astonishing amounts of waste every single day. If human waste made historical cities smell unpleasant, animals ensured they never got the chance to recover. Today, most city residents might encounter a few pigeons, the occasional dog, and perhaps a determined seagull attempting grand theft of a sandwich. An ordinary medieval street would have considered that remarkably quiet. Animals were everywhere. Horses pulled carts filled with goods from sunrise until sunset. Donkeys carried heavy loads through narrow alleys. Oxen dragged wagons too large for horses. Chickens wandered wherever they pleased, apparently believing every road belonged to them. Pigs rooted through rubbish looking for food, while goats happily sampled anything that looked remotely edible, including laundry if given the opportunity. Each one left something behind. A single horse can produce over 20 kilograms of manure in a day. Now imagine a busy city with thousands of horses moving through its streets every morning. Add hundreds of oxen, donkeys, mules, cattle and pigs, and suddenly the ground beneath your feet becomes less like a road and more like an enormous compost experiment. Street cleaners did exist. Many cities hired workers whose job was to shovel manure into carts and haul it away. Farmers often welcomed this waste because animal manure made excellent fertilizer. In fact, horse dung had genuine economic value. It wasn't unusual for people to collect it before someone else did. Unfortunately, there was always more arriving. Imagine trying to empty a bathtub while someone keeps turning the tap back on. That was essentially the daily challenge facing medieval sanitation workers. By the time one street had been cleaned, another dozen carts had already passed through the next one. Warm weather only made matters worse. Fresh manure quickly attracted flies in astonishing numbers. Mixed with mud and rainwater, it formed thick layers that clung stubbornly to boots, wagon wheels and the hems of expensive clothing. Wealthy ladies lifting their dresses while crossing muddy streets weren't making a fashion statement. They were trying to avoid carrying half the city's livestock home with them. Then there were the slaughterhouses. Many towns kept butchers near rivers, so unwanted animal parts could be washed away more easily. Blood, fat, bones and discarded organs created smells that lingered long after the day's work had ended. Tanneries were even worse, soaking hides in mixtures that included urine and other unpleasant ingredients to turn raw skins into leather. It wasn't exactly the romantic version of history shown in paintings. Yet people still filled these streets every day, buying food, chatting with neighbours, and going about ordinary life. They couldn't eliminate the smells, so they searched for another solution. If they couldn't make the city cleaner, perhaps they could simply make it smell different. People in the past weren't oblivious to the smell. Contrary to the popular stereotype, medieval and ancient people didn't wander through filthy streets thinking everything smelled perfectly pleasant. They noticed the odours just as you would. They simply had very different ideas about what caused them, and even stranger ideas about how to deal with them. One of the most widespread beliefs was that bad smells themselves caused disease. This theory, known centuries later as the miasma theory, suggested that sickness spread through foul air rising from rotting matter, swamps, sewage, and decaying bodies. Long before anyone knew bacteria existed, the logic seemed reasonable. Places that smelled terrible often were unhealthy. The conclusion was understandable, even if the science wasn't quite right. So naturally, people tried to surround themselves with pleasant smells instead. The wealthy had the easiest solution. Perfumes made from roses, lavender, violets, jasmine, and exotic spices became symbols of both luxury and protection. Noble women carried small scented cloths, while wealthy men rubbed fragrant oils onto their beards and clothing. Walking through a crowded marketplace with a handkerchief soaked in perfume wasn't just fashionable. Many genuinely believed it helped filter dangerous air. If you've ever sprayed too much air freshener in a bathroom instead of actually cleaning it, congratulations. You've accidentally participated in a sanitation strategy with a history stretching back hundreds of years. Doctors joined in as well. During outbreaks of plague, physicians often recommended carrying bundles of herbs such as rosemary, sage, mint, or thyme. Some filled small pouches with fragrant flowers and spices to wear around their necks. Others burned incense inside homes, churches, and hospitals, hoping the sweet smoke would drive away invisible poisons drifting through the air. Even ordinary households made use of pleasant scents whenever possible. Fresh rushes scattered across floors were sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or chamomile. Fireplaces burned aromatic woods when families could afford them. Kitchens filled with cinnamon, cloves, garlic, onions, and roasting meat occasionally overwhelmed less pleasant odours nearby, though whether that counted as an improvement probably depended on what had been lying in the street outside. Cities themselves occasionally attempted more dramatic solutions. Officials ordered streets swept before important ceremonies. Public spaces were sprinkled with scented water. Bonfires burned in squares to cleanse the air, filling neighbourhoods with thick smoke that was somehow considered healthier than the smells it replaced. The irony is almost impressive. Instead of eliminating the source of the odour, people often focused on overpowering it. Eventually, however, a few cities began asking a different question. What if the answer wasn't stronger perfume, but less filth in the first place? For thousands of years, cities accepted bad smells as an unavoidable fact of urban life. Then, very slowly, people began to wonder if they didn't have to. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There wasn't a single king who declared, "From tomorrow onward, everything shall smell delightful." If only history were that simple. Instead, cleaner cities emerged through hundreds of small improvements, repeated over generations. One of the first changes was surprisingly straightforward. People began making rules. Medieval towns across Europe introduced laws requiring residents to keep the area outside their homes reasonably clean. Shopkeepers swept the street in front of their businesses. Households were expected to avoid dumping waste directly into busy roads. Some cities appointed inspectors who fined people for leaving rubbish where it didn't belong. Whether those rules were always obeyed is another matter entirely. Human beings have possessed the remarkable ability to ignore sanitation regulations for as long as sanitation regulations have existed. Still, progress slowly accumulated. dedicated street cleaners became more common in growing cities. Armed with brooms, shovels, carts, and an impressive tolerance for unpleasant working conditions, they collected manure, rubbish and mud before they piled up beyond control. It wasn't glamorous work, but without them, many cities would have become almost impossible to navigate. Roads improved as well. Instead of simple dirt tracks that trapped every bit of rain and waste, more streets were paved with stone. This made cleaning easier, reduced muddy puddles, and prevented years' worth of filth from soaking directly into the ground beneath people's feet. Water also became part of the solution. Engineers expanded drainage systems, dug better gutters, and repaired aging sewers. Some cities invested in underground channels that carried wastewater away from crowded neighbourhoods, instead of allowing it to stagnate in open ditches. It wasn't perfect, but every improvement made the streets just a little more bearable. The biggest turning point arrived during the 19th century. Rapid industrialisation had packed enormous numbers of people into cities, and outbreaks of diseases like cholera repeatedly devastated entire neighbourhoods. Doctors and engineers finally recognised that waste wasn't simply unpleasant, it was dangerous. Even before scientists fully understood bacteria, governments realised that cleaner water and proper sewage systems dramatically reduced deadly epidemics. Suddenly, sanitation became a matter of public survival rather than personal comfort. Massive sewer networks were constructed beneath cities like London and Paris. Regular garbage collection became organised instead of occasional. Clean drinking water was separated from wastewater, and streets were washed more frequently than ever before. For the first time in history, cities began winning their centuries-old battle against bad smells. Not because perfume became stronger, but because the source of the odour was finally being removed. The strangest part of this story isn't that historical cities smelled so terrible. It's that modern cities usually don't. Think about your average morning. You leave your house, walk down the street, perhaps pass a bakery, a coffee shop, a few parked cars, and maybe a garbage truck making its rounds. There are certainly smells, but they're temporary. Within a few minutes, they've disappeared. The garbage is collected, the streets are swept, storm drains carry away rainwater, toilets flush with the push of a button, and wastewater vanishes into an underground system you almost never think about again. That's the remarkable part. The greatest sanitation system in history is the one you rarely notice. For thousands of years, people dreamed of cleaner, healthier cities without fully understanding how to achieve them. Today, millions of kilometres of underground pipes quietly transport sewage away from homes every single day. Water treatment plants clean billions of litres of wastewater before it's returned to rivers and seas. Garbage trucks collect mountains of rubbish on carefully planned schedules. Street sweepers remove dust, leaves and litter before they accumulate into something far worse. Entire professions now exist to solve problems most of us never even see. Ironically, the cleaner a city becomes, the easier it is to forget how much work it takes to keep it that way. If the trash collection stopped for only a week, people would notice immediately. If the sewers stopped working for a month, cities would begin to resemble places our ancestors knew all too well. History has shown just how quickly nature reclaims neglected streets. During wars, sieges, epidemics, and natural disasters, sanitation systems often collapsed first. Within days, rubbish accumulated. Animals returned. Waste remained where it fell. The familiar smells that modern society had nearly forgotten came rushing back with surprising speed. Cleanliness, it turns out, isn't permanent. It's something every generation has to maintain. Perhaps that's why ancient writers complained so often about dirty streets. They weren't unusually tolerant of bad smells. They simply lived in a world where keeping a city clean required constant labour limited technology, and the cooperation of thousands of people who didn't always feel like cooperating. So the next time you step outside after a summer rain and notice that the air smells fresh instead of foul, it's worth remembering that you're experiencing something incredibly unusual by historical standards. For the overwhelming majority of human history, the streets smelled of animals, smoke, waste, damp earth, and everyday life. The miracle isn't that our ancestors lived with those smells. The miracle is that, after thousands of years of trial and error, we finally learned how to leave most of them behind. If you could step into ancient Egypt expecting dazzling gold crowns and impossibly elaborate robes, you'd probably be surprised by how little people were actually wearing. Not because they lacked fashion sense. Quite the opposite. They simply lived in one of the hottest places on Earth, where surviving the afternoon sun took priority over wearing 6 unnecessary layers of fabric. While much of Europe wouldn't discover the joy of lightweight summer clothing for another few thousand years, the Egyptians had already mastered the art of staying cool while somehow looking effortlessly elegant. The secret was linen. Unlike wool, which traps heat, linen is light, breathable, and remarkably comfortable in hot weather. It came from the flax plant, which grew along the fertile banks of the Nile. Harvesting it was only the beginning. Workers soaked the stalks, separated the tough fibres, spun them into thread, and finally wove them into cloth. It was a slow process requiring patience and skill, but the result was a fabric perfectly suited to Egypt's dry climate. For ordinary farmers and labourers, clothing remained practical. Most men wore a simple linen kilt wrapped around the waist, allowing them to work comfortably in the fields or on construction sites. Women commonly wore straight-fitting linen dresses held up by shoulder straps. Children often wore very little clothing until they grew older, which made perfect sense when summer temperatures regularly climbed high enough to make even sandals seem optional. Then there were the wealthy. The amount of fabric didn't necessarily increase dramatically, but its quality certainly did. Fine linen became so delicately woven that Greek writers later claimed some Egyptian garments looked almost transparent. Rich families prized brilliantly white linen, a sign that servants had spent hours washing and bleaching the fabric under the Egyptian sun. Keeping white clothes spotless in a world full of dust, mud, and livestock was no small achievement. It quietly announced that someone else probably handled your laundry. Jewellery completed the outfit. Gold collars, bracelets, rings, necklaces, and colourful beads transformed relatively simple clothing into unmistakable displays of status. Clothing itself was often understated, allowing precious metals and gemstones to capture attention instead. The overall style feels surprisingly modern. Clean lines, lightweight fabrics, minimal layers, elegant accessories. Less was often considered more, provided the less happened to be made from exceptionally fine linen. But there was one fashion choice that puzzles many people today. If Egyptians valued cleanliness so highly, why do so many statues and paintings show them wearing enormous, carefully styled wigs instead of their own hair? If there is one thing that immediately stands out in Egyptian art, it is the hair. Or rather, the impressive amount of hair that often wasn't hair at all. Walk through any museum filled with Egyptian statues, wall paintings, or tomb carvings, and you'll notice something curious. Men and women alike appear with thick black wigs, carefully curled braids, or shoulder-length hairstyles that look impossibly neat, despite living in a country where summer temperatures regularly soared above 40 degrees. It seems completely backwards. Why would anyone living beside the scorching Sahara choose to wear extra hair? The answer begins with something surprisingly simple. Many Egyptians preferred to shave their heads. At first glance, that sounds like an unusual beauty trend. In reality, it was one of the most practical decisions you could make. A shaved head stayed cooler under the relentless sun, was easier to wash, and dramatically reduced one persistent nuisance that has bothered humans for thousands of years: lice. Without modern shampoos or medicine, head lice could spread quickly, especially in crowded households. Shaving the scalp made the tiny pests far easier to control. Priests often shaved not only their heads, but their entire bodies as part of ritual cleanliness, while many members of the upper classes adopted similar habits for comfort and hygiene. Of course, appearing completely bald all the time wasn't always fashionable. That's where wigs entered the picture. A well-made wig allowed someone to enjoy the comfort of a shaved head, while presenting an elegant appearance whenever they stepped outside. It was rather like owning several hats, except each one happened to be made of carefully styled hair. The finest wigs belonged to the wealthy. Craftsmen produced them using real human hair, sometimes mixed with sheep's wool or plant fibres to add volume. Individual strands were braided, curled, or stitched together with astonishing precision. Some wigs contained dozens of tiny braids, each arranged into intricate geometric patterns that required hours of skilled work. They weren't simply decorations. Wealthy Egyptians often owned multiple wigs for different occasions. One might be suitable for a religious festival, another for a banquet, and another for everyday visits around the city. Servants carefully stored them when not in use, protecting them from dust and insects, just as someone today might care for an expensive tailored suit. Some wigs became even more luxurious. Small cones made from scented fats or waxes were sometimes placed on top during celebrations. As the day grew warmer, these slowly softened, releasing pleasant fragrances over the wearer's hair and clothing. Imagine attending a dinner party where your hairstyle gradually transformed into a perfume dispenser. Practical, fashionable, and perhaps just a little greasy. But Egyptian beauty routines didn't stop with elegant wigs. Their most famous cosmetic was something almost everyone wore, from pharaohs to farmers, adults to children. It was the bold black eyeliner that still defines ancient Egypt in our imagination today. If you could borrow just one beauty product from ancient Egypt, it probably wouldn't be the gold jewellery. It would be the eyeliner. No other cosmetic is more closely associated with Egypt than those bold black lines stretching elegantly around the eyes. Pharaohs wore it, queens wore it, priests wore it, soldiers wore it, children often wore it. Rich and poor alike reached for it every morning, making eyeliner one of the few fashion trends that crossed almost every social class. It wasn't reserved for special occasions. It was simply part of getting dressed. The most common cosmetic was called kohl, a dark powder made by grinding minerals such as galena, a lead-based ore, into an incredibly fine pigment. Green eye paint was also popular, especially during earlier periods, and was commonly produced from crushed malachite, a beautiful green copper mineral. Applying it required surprisingly delicate tools. Small wooden, ivory, or bronze sticks served as applicators, while the cosmetics themselves were stored in beautifully carved jars and tiny decorated containers. Archaeologists have uncovered countless cosmetic palettes inside tombs, many of them buried alongside their owners as if eyeliner were just as essential in the afterlife as it was on Earth. Considering how often it appears in Egyptian art, perhaps they genuinely believed it was. The striking appearance certainly helped. Dark lines made the eyes appear larger, sharper, and more expressive. Combined with carefully shaped eyebrows, the look was elegant without being overly complicated. Modern makeup artists still recreate the style more than 3,000 years later, which is perhaps the highest compliment any fashion trend can receive. But beauty wasn't the only reason Egyptians painted around their eyes. many believed the cosmetics offered protection. The Eye of Horus was one of Egypt's most powerful symbols, representing healing, protection, and good health. Wearing eye makeup echoed that sacred imagery, giving the cosmetic a spiritual significance beyond simple appearance. Looking fashionable and inviting divine protection at the same time seemed like a rather efficient morning routine. There may even have been practical benefits. Modern scientific studies suggest that some ingredients found in ancient Egyptian eye cosmetics may have helped reduce certain eye infections by stimulating the skin's natural defences. That doesn't mean every jar of coal was medicine, nor should anyone begin grinding ancient minerals into homemade eyeliner. But in Egypt's dusty climate, where bright sunlight, blowing sand, and insects constantly irritated the eyes, cosmetics may have provided more than decoration. It was a rare case where fashion, religion, and everyday practicality all pointed in the same direction. Of course, beautiful eyes were only part of the picture. The Egyptians also wanted the rest of their body to smell just as impressive, and in a hot climate where people spent much of the day under the blazing sun, that required an entire world of perfumes, oils, and fragrant rituals. If you spent an afternoon under the Egyptian sun, there was one thing you could be absolutely certain of. You were going to sweat. The Nile Valley was beautiful, fertile, and capable of producing astonishing harvests. It was also incredibly hot for much of the year. Long days working outdoors, walking through dusty streets, or attending crowded festivals made personal fragrance less of a luxury and more of a daily concern. Fortunately, the Egyptians approached perfume with the same enthusiasm they brought to architecture, religion, and almost everything else. To them, pleasant scents weren't merely enjoyable, they were civilized. Perfumes played a central role in everyday life, religious ceremonies, celebrations, and even medicine. Temples filled the air with fragrant incense. Noble homes stored expensive oils in beautifully carved alabaster jars. Guests arriving at banquets expected to be greeted not only with food and music, but with delightful aromas drifting through the room. The ingredients came from both Egypt and lands far beyond it. Flowers such as lilies and lotus blossoms provided delicate fragrances. Herbs, myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, and exotic resins arrived through long-distance trade, making some perfumes extraordinarily valuable. The finest scents could cost a small fortune, their ingredients having travelled hundreds or even thousands of kilometres before reaching the banks of the Nile. Unlike modern perfumes, however, Egyptian fragrances were usually oil-based rather than alcohol-based. Scented oils were rubbed directly onto the skin, helping to keep it moisturized while releasing fragrance throughout the day. In Egypt's dry climate, this had an added benefit. The oils protected the skin from drying out under the relentless sun, combining skincare and perfume into one remarkably practical product. The wealthy often took this a step further. During elegant banquets and festivals, guests sometimes wore small cones made of perfumed wax or scented fat balanced carefully on top of their wigs. At first glance, they looked rather unusual, almost like tiny hats that had forgotten what hats were supposed to do. As the evening grew warmer, the cones slowly softened. Rather than dripping dramatically over everyone's face, as old movies often suggest, they likely released fragrant oils little by little, surrounding the wearer with the scent of flowers, spices, and resins for hours. Imagine wearing a slow-motion perfume diffuser on your head while trying not to spill your wine. Graceful posture suddenly became even more important. Good smells also carried spiritual meaning. The gods themselves were believed to appreciate beautiful fragrances. Burning incense inside temples wasn't simply about creating a pleasant atmosphere. Rising clouds of scented smoke symbolized prayers reaching heaven, while sweet aromas reflected purity, devotion, and divine favour. In ancient Egypt, smelling good wasn't just about impressing your neighbours. It was also a way of honouring the gods. But even the finest perfume couldn't complete an Egyptian look on its own. Beauty was a full routine, involving mirrors, combs, lotions, jewellery, and daily rituals that would feel surprisingly familiar to many of us today. If an ancient Egyptian noble could visit your bathroom today, they would probably recognise more of it than you might expect. A mirror, combs, small containers filled with creams, perfume bottles, tweezers, perhaps even a favourite moisturiser sitting beside the sink. Despite living over 3,000 years ago, Egyptians took personal grooming remarkably seriously. Looking after your appearance wasn't considered vanity. It was a sign of health, self-respect, and proper civilization. Just as important, cleanliness had strong religious associations. The gods valued purity, and presenting yourself well reflected both discipline and order. The day often began with washing. Those who lived near the Nile had access to abundant water, although daily bathing varied depending on wealth and occupation. Wealthier households could afford servants to bring fresh water, while ordinary families washed as circumstances allowed. Soap, as we know it today, did not exist, but Egyptians cleaned themselves using mixtures made from natural oils, animal fats, and alkaline salts that removed dirt surprisingly well. After washing came skincare. The Egyptian climate was wonderfully dry for preserving monuments, but far less forgiving toward human skin. Constant sunshine, dry air, and blowing sand could quickly leave skin cracked and uncomfortable. To prevent this, both men and women rubbed scented oils and ointments onto their faces, hands, and bodies. These moisturized the skin while adding a pleasant fragrance that lingered throughout the day. Hair, or more accurately, wigs, required attention too. A fine wig was carefully combed, dusted, and adjusted before being worn. Decorative hairpins, ribbons, or jewellery might be added depending on the occasion. Wealthy families often employed servants, whose responsibilities included maintaining wigs, arranging cosmetics, and preparing clothing each morning. Jewellery was chosen with equal care. Necklaces of colourful faience beads, broad gold collars, rings, bracelets, earrings, and amulets completed an outfit. Many pieces weren't simply decorative. Scarabs, the Eye of Horus, and other symbols were believed to offer protection or bring good fortune, allowing fashion and faith to coexist quite comfortably. Even mirrors reveal something fascinating about Egyptian life. Made from polished copper or bronze rather than glass, they reflected enough light for someone to carefully apply cosmetics. Some surviving mirrors feature beautifully carved handles shaped like lotus flowers or the goddess Hathor, transforming an everyday object into a small work of art. By the time an Egyptian noble stepped outside, every detail had been considered. Fresh linen, carefully arranged jewellery, perfumed skin, perfectly applied eyeliner, an elegant wig. It wasn't excessive by Egyptian standards. It was simply being presentable. And perhaps the most remarkable part is just how many of those daily habits, washing, moisturising, styling hair, choosing accessories and checking the mirror before leaving home, still feel completely familiar thousands of years later. When most people picture ancient Egyptian fashion, they imagine something impossibly distant. Golden masks, towering pyramids, pharaohs wrapped in glittering jewellery. It feels like another world. And yet, if you look past the statues and museum displays, the people themselves begin to feel surprisingly familiar. They worried about bad hair days. They experimented with makeup. They searched for the perfect fragrance. They moisturized dry skin. They bought expensive accessories to impress friends, And just like people today, they occasionally followed fashion simply because everyone else was doing it. Beauty in ancient Egypt wasn't reserved for queens like Nefertiti or Cleopatra. It reached nearly every level of society. Of course, wealth determined the quality of your clothing and cosmetics. A farmer's linen was far simpler than a noble's finely woven garment, and not everyone could afford imported incense or gold jewellery. But the desire to look neat, healthy and attractive belonged to everyone. Even children often wore protective amulets. Workers carefully kept their linen clean whenever possible. Soldiers lined their eyes with coal before campaigns. Priests shaved their entire bodies in pursuit of ritual purity. Fashion wasn't a separate part of life. It blended seamlessly into religion, health, social status, and personal identity. That is perhaps what makes Egyptian beauty so fascinating. Very little of it was purely decorative. Linen kept you cool beneath the relentless sun. Wigs protected shaved heads while remaining elegant. Perfumed oils softened dry skin and masked body odour. Jewellery displayed wealth but also carried protective meanings. Eyeliner enhanced appearance while helping shield sensitive eyes from dust and bright sunlight. Again and again, practicality and beauty worked together rather than competing with one another. Modern fashion often follows the same principle. A pair of sunglasses protects your eyes while completing an outfit. A watch tells time but also makes a statement. Running shoes combine comfort with style. A favourite perfume becomes part of your personality. 3,000 years separate us from ancient Egypt, yet the logic feels remarkably familiar. Perhaps that is why Egyptian fashion has never truly disappeared. Designers continue borrowing its clean linen silhouettes. Jewellers recreate broad collars and scarab pendants. Makeup artists still teach the famous winged eyeliner first perfected along the Nile. Even luxury perfumes continue using ingredients like frankincense, myrrh, lotus, and jasmine that Egyptians treasured thousands of years ago. Their civilization may have vanished, but its sense of style never really did. So the next time you see a museum statue with dark-lined eyes, a perfectly arranged wig, and elegant white linen, remember that you are not simply looking at an ancient civilization. You are looking at people preparing for another ordinary day. People who, despite the passing of millennia, weren't all that different from us. Only considerably better at making eyeliner last in the desert heat.